Welcome to SIIA Tech Chats. I am doing something a little different this week and I'm excited about, and I think you will enjoy as well. My guest this week is the president of SIIA and my boss, Ken Wasch. Ken founded SIIA in 1985 and is now approaching his retirement at the end of this 2018 year. And throughout his tenure at SIIA, Ken has seen many historic transformations in our industry, and I wanted to take the opportunity to ask him to look back on his career and share some of his most memorable moments. So, Ken, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Rihanna. This could be fun, or it could not be fun, but I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
So take me back to 1985, Ken. What prompted you to start SIIA?
Actually, I have a small correction. It was 1984, and I started the solicitation to try to get companies to join in the fall of 1983. And the story is a funny one. It came out of a lunch a friend and I had. I was a lawyer at the U.S. Department of Energy, working on oil regulatory issues, deciding how much gasoline gas stations could have in an allocation strategy. And I had bought an Apple IIe for myself, and another friend, another lawyer at the office, also had bought an Apple IIe, and often we would meet for lunch and talk about our Apple IIes and what we were doing with them. And one day at lunch, actually it was he who said it. He says, there's no trade association for the what we call the microcomputer software industry. We should go form it. And so we worked on the project together for about 2 weeks. Then he said, my ego's fragile. You go ahead and do it, Ken. I'm going to continue to work here. And he ultimately his name is Joe Catan, and he became a very successful antitrust lawyer. And one of his most famous clients was Intel. So he did pretty well for himself. As for me, it took 6 months to get the association up and running. I didn't want to make people mad at me, so I said I wasn't going to form the trade association until I got 25 checks in hand. And so it took 4 or 5 months to get the 25 checks in hand. I kept them in an envelope, and then I deposited them, and then I elected a board of directors. The most interesting thing about electing the board of directors is we held our first meeting in Chicago in June of 1984. I was 32 years old at the time, and the first thing they did at the board meeting was to kick me out of the room. And I know, I heard later what they said. They said, who is this guy? He's not in our industry. He claims he's a Washington lawyer, though I think behind me you see my bar certificate to prove it. And then they said, how much you making at DOE? And I told them what my salary was as a GS 15 lawyer, and they said, we'll match that. And at first I said, where's the money going to come from? There wasn't enough money in the till. And they said, don't worry, the money will be there. I really didn't know what that meant, whether that meant they would contribute more or they knew that we would be successful at getting more members. But the good news is SPA, as it's known then, the Software Publishers Association, grew from the 25 members we started with in 1984 till 3 or 4 years later, we had over 1,000 members. And every imaginable company in the PC industry felt that they had to belong to their industry's trade association. There was what I would consider what we call now FOMA, the fear of missing out. They felt that there was information being disseminated, there were relationships that were happening, that if they weren't there, they felt that they would be missing out.
Fantastic. So now we bring us to 2018. What's the biggest change you've seen in our industry during your tenure as head of the association?
Well, the biggest change is presumed in the question you asked, the biggest change in our industry. Really, there isn't a single industry. When I think about, there's so many funny things about the way our industry changed. When we were trying to sell memberships, I remember saying that Ashton Tate, Lotus, and Microsoft, they all became members in 1986, which is 2 years after we started, and they each had sales of about $300 million. You think how huge these companies are today. Well, of course, Ashton Tate's out of business. Lotus got acquired, and Microsoft, has actually reached its highest stock price just in the last week. What's interesting about it is the companies that originally formed SPA were from the education and entertainment business. Our first members were people like Scholastic or Simon & Schuster or Prentice Hall or CBS Software, a whole bunch of, what it was if you were in the publishing business, publishing books or magazines, you figured software publishing is the same kind of business, and we can enter the software publishing business no differently than if we've been in the regular publishing business. You know, we just had a breakfast here at our offices today, and one of our original companies was participating today, and that was Addison Wesley, which was great to see. So the biggest changes, but what's important about the biggest changes, back in the early days of SPA, we were focused on fighting piracy. Awards, the Cody Awards started way back then, but when our government affairs committee consisted of the general counsels of the largest companies in the software business at the time. And when you think of who was there, it was, as I mentioned, Lotus and Microsoft and Ashton Tate and Borland, Computer Associates, and it was a small cadre of companies in what was the PC software business, where the product was sold on disk. I mean, today when you ask, what are the largest software companies? Well, it's even hard to define what a software company is. I mean, you wouldn't even call it a software company; you would call it a technology company. You take somebody like Relics or Pearson or McGraw-Hill. I mean, those companies would think of themselves as in the technology business, but not necessarily in the software business. Or you take somebody who's just been partially acquired, Thomson Reuters. They think of themselves as totally in the technology business. So the point is that the industry has become so broad that the secret sauce of thousands of companies would have their pedigree be the software industry, but it's not like the software industry that we would have thought of 20 or 30 years ago.
So what do you think is your biggest accomplishment in your 34 years of running SIA?
Staying in business. The biggest accomplishment, because it's interesting.
Well, thank you.
When we were formed, we had a competitor called the DAPSA, which became ITAA, Information Technology Association of America. Another competitor of ours was AEA, American Electronics Association, which merged with ITA and became Tech America. All three of those organizations are out of business, completely dissolved. And you say, why is that? Well, they maintained what I consider an older business model. And one of the things that I think we've done well, we haven't done everything well, but one of the things we've done well is to divisionalize. We recognize that people want to hang out with companies that are similar to themselves. So we have an education division, which consists of education technology companies. We have a software division, which is more horizontal in nature rather than vertical. And then we've been opportunistic in acquiring other organizations in ancillary industries. When we acquired the Information Industry Association, it consisted of companies that were, people like Reed Elsevier, Thomson, and Reuters, and Bloomberg, and financial companies. They didn't necessarily think of themselves as in the software business, but they certainly thought of themselves as in the information business. So, for instance, our largest division today is FISD, the Financial Information and Services Division, which consists of the stock exchanges of the world, vendors of financial information, and users. It's hard to believe that of the 20 largest banks in the United States, 19 are members. Everybody from J.P. Morgan Chase to brokerages like Schwab and Fidelity, to enormous companies like BlackRock and Goldman Sachs. And then you're never supposed to have a favorite member, but I do have a favorite member. It's the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange. You can't believe they're in the same organization as Pearson or BrainPop. They're a terrific organization in serving the interests of investors in Kazakhstan.
So looking back then on your career, Ken, and knowing what you know today, is there anything you would do different?
Yes, there is one important thing I would do differently, is that members will bankrupt you if you give them the chance. And that our members will always have projects that require large expenditures of funds that just say, if you follow, and I was subject to those end treaties a number of times where people say, if you spend this money on this project, we're going to love you forever, and you'll get a whole bunch of members, and it'll help grow your organization. One area was, for instance, in government procurement. A few years ago, we tried to start a whole initiative around government procurement that I know you know very well, Rihanna. That didn't pan out. There was once a group of companies that came to us and said they wanted us to build out our capabilities to fight piracy in Asia. Well, ultimately, that became a code word for spend your money instead of our money. And it became a very expensive boondoggle, which I regret having spent those funds. But we did well over a number of years in fighting piracy, and we had a few spare dollars to invest. I just wish we hadn't spent it in that way.
So what will you miss most then, Ken, about running SIA and being day to day on the job?
That is a softball question if I ever heard it. What I'm going to miss most is the fabulous people I've worked with at SIA, both staff and members over so many years. I go to all the different conferences that the SIA puts on, whether it's FISD or our education conference or software conference, and I have a lot of great friends who have been great advisors, supporters of our organization. There are a lot of very wise people in our industry. And by and large, I've just made so many great friends. I'm really going to miss so many people.
So finally, before I let you go, what does retirement look like for Ken Wasch?
Well, first I'm going to take tap dancing lessons. That's for sure. And I'm going to work on a screenplay.
We're going to have you back on the show to show us.
I'm going to work on my screenplay. You remember the show Animal House, right? Well, this one's called Animal Home, where Blutarsky and their buddies have all now gone to a retirement home, and they want to avoid, instead of getting kicked out of college, they want to avoid getting kicked out of their retirement home and having to go live with their adult children, which of course is a fate worse than death. So look for Animal Home. See if I can write the screenplay for that.
That's exciting. Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. SIA and our industry will definitely miss you. For more information on SIA, please visit our website and tune in next week for SIA Tech Chats.
Thanks, Rihanna.